day, everyone. I am Honey Villanea and I'm going to report Lecture 24, which is Discrimination and Sogie. But first, let me introduce you to what is discrimination. So, what is discrimination? Discrimination is the act of making unjustified distinctions between human beings based on the groups, classes, or other categories to which they are perceived to belong. So discrimination especially occurs when individuals or groups are unfairly treated in a way which is worse than other people are treated. So on the basis of their actual or perceived membership in a certain group or social categories. So it involves restricting members of one group from opportunities or privilege that are available to members of another group. So people may be discriminated on the basis of age, disability, sexual orientation, status as a parent, religion, national origin, pregnancy, sexual harassment, race, color and sex, and lastly, reprisal or retaliation. Age discrimination or ageism is discrimination and stereotyping based on the grounds of someone's age. So, ageism is often directed toward elderly people or adolescents and children. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 protects certain applicants and employees 40 years of age and older from employment discrimination based on age. Under this act, it is unlawful to discriminate against a person because of his or her age with respect to any term, condition, or privilege of employment. Some examples are hiring, firing, promotion, job assignments, and training. Second is disability discrimination. So, discrimination against people with disabilities in favor of people who are not is called ableism or disabilism. Studies have shown that disabled people not only need employment in order to be provided with the opportunity to earn a living, but they also need employment in order to sustain their mental health and well-being. So Title 1 and Title 5 of the Americans with Disability Act of 1990 was signed into law on July 26, 1990 by President W. Bush. The ADA provides a wide range of civil rights protection for individuals with disabilities. Titles 1 and 5 prohibits employment discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in private businesses and in state and local governments, but who are otherwise qualified for employment. So the ADA prohibits discrimination in all employment practices including job application procedures, hiring, firing, training, compensation, advancement, and any other terms, condition, or privilege of employment. So the ADA does not require preferential treatment of individuals with disabilities. As employees, as employers are free to select the most qualified applicant for the position, but it does not prohibit discrimination based solely on a candidate's real or perceived disability. Next is sexual orientation. This is a term used to describe your pattern of emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction. Sexual orientation may include attraction to the same gender or what we call homosexuality, a gender different than your own, or heterosexuality, or both men and women, bisexuality, all genders, pansexual, or neither. So like most minority groups, homosexual and bisexuals are vulnerable to prejudice and discrimination from the majority group. They may experience hatred from others because of their sexuality. Many continue to hold negative feelings toward those with non-heterosexual orientation and will discriminate against people who have them or are thought to have them. So, as the court explained, discrimination based on homosexuality or transgender status necessarily entails discrimination based on sex. So, the first cannot happen without the second. So, for example, if an employer fires an employee because she is a woman who is married to a woman but would not do to the same to a man married to a woman. So, the employer is taking an action because of the employee's sex, because the employee would not have taken place but for the employee being a woman. So similarly, if an employer fires an employee because that person was identified as a male at birth but uses feminine pronouns and identifies as a female, so the employer is taking action against the individual because of sex, since the action would not have been taken but for the fact that the employee was originally identified as a male. Next discrimination is the status as a parent. So on May 2, 2000, Executive Order 13152 amending Executive Order 11478 was signed to prohibit discrimination based on an individual's status as a parent in the federal government. So status as a parent is defined as an individual who, with respect to an individual who is under the age of 18 or who is 18 or older but is incapable of self-care because of a physical or mental disability, is a biological parent, an adoptive parent, a foster parent, a step parent, a custodian of a legal ward, in loco parentis over such an individual, or actively seeking legal custody or adoption of such an individual. Next is religious discrimination. Religious discrimination is valuing or treating people or groups differently because of what they do or do not believe in, or because of their feelings toward a given religion. So Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employers from discriminating against individuals because of their religion in hiring, firing, and other terms and conditions of employment. So the Act also requires employers to reasonably accommodate the religious practices of an individual or prospective employee, unless doing so would create an undue hardship on the employer. But what is an what is an undue hardship? An employer can claim undue hardship when an employee's request for religious accommodation requires more than administrative costs. Undue hardship can also be demonstrated if changing a bona fide practice such as seniority to accommodate an employee's religious practice denies another employee an entitlement. Next up is national origin. Discrimination on the basis of nationality is usually included in employment laws. So it is unlawful to discriminate against an employee because of the individual's birthplace, ancestry, culture, or linguistic characteristics common to a specific ethnic group. Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects individuals against employment discrimination on the basis of national origin as well as race, color, religion, and sex. Next is pregnancy. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act is an amendment to Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under this act, discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions constitute unlawful sex or pregnancy discrimination. So, if an employee is temporarily unable to perform her job due to pregnancy, The agency must treat her the same as any other temporarily disabled employee. For example, if an employee with a broken hand receives modified task or alternative assignment, the same must be done for a pregnant employee. So an employer may not have a rule that prohibits an employee from returning to work for a predetermined length of time after childbirth. So for instance, an employer may not require an employee to return to work 4 weeks after childbirth. Sexual harassment is an unwanted and unwelcome advances of a sexual nature. It could be touch, written note, joke, picture, and etc. It can be intentional or unintentional. So there are two types of sexual harassment. The first type is quid pro quo. This means that a person in a position of power over another offers to trade a tangible employment action or benefit, so such as promotion for a sexual favor. Only someone who has the power to control the victim's job destiny can commit this type of sexual harassment. So the second type is hostile work environment. In this instance, the environment is created by obvious sexually oriented activity by employees and supervisors. Next is race, color, and sex. Race discrimination occurs when employees are treated differently than other employees because of unalterable characteristics such as physical features attributed to their race. For example, this act prohibits discrimination against an Asian individual because of physical characteristics such as facial features or height. Color discrimination occurs when persons are treated differently than others because of their skin pigmentation. So color discrimination can occur within the same ethnic group, whereas sex discrimination occurs when men and women who are similarly situated are treated differently based on gender. So it takes place when deliberate, repeated, or unsolicited verbal comments, gesture, or physical contacts of a sexual nature are unwelcome. The last type is reprisal or retaliation. So retaliation is a discriminatory or adverse action made against a person who files a complaint or charge, participates in an investigation or charge, or opposes an employment practice made illegal by any of the statutes. Employees are protected from retaliation in the EEO or Equal Employment Opportunity process. So the most obvious type of retaliation are denial of a promotion, refusal to fire, denial of denial of job benefits, demotion, suspension, and discharge. Other types of adverse actions include threats, reprimands, negative evaluations, and harassment. So let's talk about Sogie, or which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So what is Sogie? So the sexual orientation and gender identity expression Equality Bill is also known as the Anti-Discrimination Bill. Is a bill that was proposed by the Congress of the Philippines. It is intended to prevent various economic and public accommodation related acts of discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. The current version of the bill is sponsored by Kaka Bagao, Geraldine Roman, Tom Villarin in the House of Representatives, and Risa Hontiveros in the Senate. The version in the House of Representatives passed its third reading most recently on September 20, 2017, but died in the Senate. It has been refiled for the 80th Congress. So there are types of sexual orientation based on Sogie. So, but first, let's define what is sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes to whom a person is sexually attracted. So some people are attracted to people of a particular gender, others are attracted to people of more than one gender, some are not attracted to anyone. The first type is asexual. People who are asexual may not be sexually attracted to people of I I may not be sexually attracted to anyone or interested in sex, but they feel emotionally close to other people. Next is bisexual. People who are bisexual are romantically and physically attracted to members of both sexes. The two common misconceptions are that bisexual people are attracted to everyone and anyone, or that they just haven't decided. Bisexual is often referred to as bi. Next type is gay. Gay is a person who as identifies as a gay, typically only feels sexual attraction toward people of the same gender. It is sometimes called homosexual. Lesbian. Lesbian is those who identified as that as lesbian are usually women who feel sexual or romantic attraction to other women. So sometimes or alternately same gender loving woman or woman loving woman. Pansexual or fluid. This sexual orientation refer to people who feel attraction toward people of all genders and sexes. So a typical identifier of those who are pansexual is that gender is not a huge factor in sexual or romantic attraction. Sometimes also or alternately omnisexual or polysexual. Questioning is one who may be unsure of, reconsidering, or chooses to hold off identifying their sexual identity or gender expression or identity. Queer is traditionally a derogatory term yet reclaimed and appropriated by some LGBTQ individuals as a term of self-identification. So it is an umbrella term which embraces a matrix of sexual preferences, gender expression, and habits that are not of the heterosexual, heteronormative, or gender binary majority. It is not a universally accepted term by all members of the LGBTQ community, and it is often considered offensive when used by heterosexual. So the last type is straight. Attractive to people of the opposite sex, also sometimes generally used to refer to people whose sexualities are socially normative, alternately referred to as heterosexual. And there are different types of gender identity and expression. The ways in which a person identifies and or express their gender, including the self-image, appearance, and embodiment of gender roles. So one's sex is usually assigned at birth based on one's physical biology. One's gender is one's internal sense of self-identity, and one's gender expression is how one embodies gender attributes, presentations, roles, and more. Androgyny. And first, let's define what is androgyny. Androgyny is the mixing of masculine and feminine gender expression or the lack of gender identification. The terms androgyny, agender, and nutreusis Neutroids are sometimes used when people who identify as genderless, non-gendered, beyond or between genders or some combination thereof. Cisgender is a gender identity that society considers to match the biological sex assigned at birth. So the prefix cis means on the side of or not across from, a term used to call attention to the privilege of people who are not transgender. Next is cross-gender. Cross-dressing refers to occasionally wearing clothing of the opposite gender, and someone who considers this as an integral part of their identity may be identified as a cross-gender. Note that the term cross-gender is preferably to transvestite and neither may ever be used to describe a transsexual person. So, hence, cross-dressing is not necessarily tied to erotic activity or sexual orientation. Gender queer, third gender, or gender fluid. These terms are used by people who identify as being between and or other than male or female. So, they may feel they are neither, a little bit of both, or they may feel restricted by gender labels. We have also intersex. This is a general term used for a variety of genetic, hormonal, or anatomical condition in which a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the typical definition of male or female. So some intersex individuals identify as just as transgender or gender variant, others do not. So take note that hermaphrodite is an obsolete term that is not currently considered appropriate. So the next type is transgender. Transgender is first going to distinguish gender benders with no desire for surgery or hormones from transsexuals, those who desire to legally and medically change their sex. More recently, transgender and or trans has become an umbrella term properly used to refer to all people who transgress dominant conceptions of gender, or at least who identify themselves as doing so. So the definition continues to evolve. Transsexual has historically been used to refer individuals who have medically and legally changed their sex or who wish to do so. Most transsexual people feel a conflict between their gender identity and the sex they were assigned at birth. Others label used within this group are MTF or male to female or trans woman, and FTM, female to male or trans man. Lastly is the two-spirit, a person who identified with the Native American tradition of characterizing certain members of the community as having the spirit of both the male and the female genders. That would be all, and thank you for listening.